Think about the last time a coworker, someone with your precise title, your tenure, your background, received a massive, unexpected promotion.
Oh, that is a tough scenario to picture.
Right. Did you feel like pure, unadulterated joy for them?
Well,
Or did your stomach just drop?
I think most people would admit to the stomach drop.
Yeah, did you feel a sudden, sharp tightening in your chest?
Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we're taking a deep dive into that specific, sickening drop in your stomach.
And we are looking at a text from the 18th century that argues that feeling is not just some passing bad mood.
No, it's not. It is, according to the text, a literal spiritual cancer designed to devour you from the inside out.
Our guide for this diagnosis is Jonathan Edwards. We're looking specifically at his sermon series, Charity and Its Fruits.
Right, where he dissects 1 Corinthians 13:4, which states very simply, charity envieth not.
So our mission for this deep dive is to understand the true anatomy of envy. We want to figure out why you feel diminished when someone else succeeds, how that feeling manipulates your actions, and what the theological antidote is for a heart that is so prone to this kind of comparison.
Edwards wastes absolutely no time in establishing the severity of this condition. I mean, he uses some striking imagery right out of the gate.
It's a very visceral way to frame our discussion, isn't it?
It really is. He describes an envious disposition as an eating cancer that preys on the vitals.
Wow, an eating cancer.
Yeah, and he also compares an envious person to a caterpillar.
A caterpillar,
Okay.
like the insect.
Yes, think about what a caterpillar does in a garden. A caterpillar doesn't just eat random dead leaves. It delights most in devouring those flourishing, beautiful trees and plants.
Oh, so it targets the healthy stuff?
Precisely. Envy is not categorized here as a minor character flaw or a slight personality quirk. It is a destructive force that actively consumes life.
Right, it eats away the life of the person harboring it, and it seeks to consume the flourishing of the person it's directed toward.
And Edwards positions this spirit as the absolute antithesis of divine charity.
Because if a Christian spirit of charity builds up, envy acts as that caterpillar, right?
Yes, seeking out what is green, growing, and beautiful, specifically to tear it down.
That sets a very serious tone for our analysis. It frames envy as a lethal threat to the soul that requires, surgical precision to isolate and remove.
It does, but before we can talk about removing it, we have to isolate what it actually is.
And I appreciate how precisely this source material pins it down. Because it's not just wanting what someone else has.
Right. Wanting what someone else has is covetousness. Envy is darker.
Much darker. Edwards defines it as a spirit of dissatisfaction with and opposition to the prosperity and happiness of others as compared with our own.
The pivot point of that entire definition rests on the concept of comparison.
Yeah, the comparative element is huge here.
The source material states that the thing the envious person is opposed to is the comparative superiority of another's state of honor or happiness.
It's a fascinating psychological insight into how our minds calculate status,
It really is. The envious person isn't necessarily angry that someone else has a good thing. They are angry that the other person has a better thing.
Right, or has something that elevates them above where they currently stand.
The text asserts that human nature possesses a built-in disposition where men love to be uppermost.
We want to be at the top of the pile.
Yeah, and when we see others above us, that innate disposition is crossed.
So we perceive another person's success not as a neutral fact of their life, but as a personal demotion in ours.
That word comparative is the engine of the entire envious mechanism. Men dislike the prosperity of others because they think it makes those who possess it superior in some respect to themselves.
But the text takes it a step further, doesn't it? Noting something even more revealing about human depravity.
It does. From this same disposition, a person might even dislike another being equal to them in honor or happiness.
Wait, really? Even just being equal?
Yes. The observation is made that men cannot bear a rival much, if any, better than a superior.
That's incredible. Why is that?
The underlying reason provided is that men love to be singular and alone in their eminence and advancement.
So it's not enough to be successful. The corrupt human heart desires to be uniquely successful.
Precisely. The presence of an equal diminishes that perceived uniqueness. If someone else shares the spotlight feels less bright.
The envious mind views the world as a strict hierarchy, like a zero-sum game where any elevation of a neighbor automatically results in a lowering of the self.
Yeah, the prosperity of others becomes an intolerable affront to this intense desire for singular, solitary eminence.
Which explains a really interesting quirk about how this operates in our daily lives.
What do you mean?
Well, we rarely experience this kind of bitter, chest-tightening envy toward strangers who are vastly beyond our social or professional sphere.
Oh, right. We envy our peers.
Yeah, we envy our equals. Think about runners in a marathon. If I'm a casual weekend jogger, I don't harbor deep, seething resentment toward the elite world-class athlete who finishes 3 hours ahead of me.
No, because they are in a completely different universe. There's no comparative threat there.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. But if there's a runner right at my shoulder, someone in my age bracket with my precise fitness level, and they suddenly find an extra burst of speed and pull ahead in the final stretch.
That is the person who drives you crazy.
Yeah, that is the person who crosses the disposition to be uppermost. We are comfortable when others are far below us, and we are fairly indifferent when they're impossibly far above us.
But we are agonizingly sensitive to the movements of those who are near us.
Yes. Our rivals, our peers, whose advancement threatens our desire to be singular in our specific, localized eminence.
That is a perfect modern parallel to the biblical evidence Edwards provides. He points to the Old Testament narrative of Moses and Joshua in the book of Numbers chapter 11.
Yeah, that story illustrates this precise dynamic of proximity and rivalry.
Two men, Eldad and Medad, are suddenly given the spirit of prophecy and begin prophesying in the camp.
And Joshua's immediate reaction is panic, right?
Total panic. He runs to Moses and says, "My Lord Moses, forbid them."
Joshua is experiencing intense envy, and as Moses points out, Joshua is envying for Moses' sake.
Right. Joshua perceives that Moses' singular eminence as the sole prophet and leader is being threatened by these newcomers sharing in the same privilege.
But Moses demonstrates the opposite spirit, the true spirit of charity. He says, "Would God that all the Lord's people were prophets."
Moses had no need to be singular and alone in his eminence.
The text also uses the example of Joseph's brothers in Genesis 37, which is a classic example.
They hear Joseph's dream, which implies that his parents and brothers would bow down to him.
And they are his brothers, his peers, dwelling in the same tents.
The very suggestion that he would have power over them, that he would be elevated to a comparative superiority, triggers an intense destructive reaction.
They could not tolerate the idea of a sibling becoming their superior. So if we have this agonizing internal fear of losing our rank, it can't possibly stay hidden in our heads for long, can it?
No, it inevitably bleeds out into our behavior.
How does this internal disposition actually manifest in the real world, according to the source?
The text outlines what we might call the two faces of envy. It argues that this disposition becomes visible in two distinct respects.
Okay, what are they?
First, in an uneasiness with another's prosperity, and second, in a direct dislike of their person.
Let's look at that first manifestation, uneasiness.
So instead of rejoicing in the prosperity of others, the envious man will be troubled by it. It becomes a literal grievance to his spirit to see others rise so high.
Hearing about their advantages, honors, or preferments is actively uncomfortable for him.
The text uses the historical account of Haman and Mordecai from the book of Esther to illustrate this severe uneasiness.
Haman is such a fascinating character for this. He's a man who has reached the absolute pinnacle of political power.
Right. He has wealth, he has the king's favor, he has a large family.
Yet his internal state is completely destabilized by the presence of one specific person who refuses to bow to him.
The psychology of Haman is highly instructive for understanding this uneasiness. The text quotes Esther 5:13.
What does he say there?
Haman is recounting his vast wealth, the multitude of his children, and all the promotions the king had given him. He has every conceivable earthly reason to be satisfied.
Right.
Yet he concludes his list of triumphs by saying, "Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate."
Wow. So Haman's ability to enjoy his own abundant blessings is completely neutralized by the sight of Mordecai.
This demonstrates how envy acts as that eating cancer. It devours your own capacity for gratitude and contentment.
And from such a spirit, the envious person stands ready to rejoice at anything that happens to diminish the honor and comfort of others, right?
Yeah, because the other person's elevation is the source of their uneasiness. So the logical, albeit corrupted solution for the envious mind is to see that person brought down.
They don't just passively hope for a downfall, do they?
No, they actively study how to lower the other person's estate. Haman planned and schemed, even building a gallows, to bring down Mordecai and cure his own internal torment.
That act of scheming is a critical component. The uneasiness drives actual tactical maneuvers.
The envious person will gladly embrace the very first opportunity to pull the successful person down.
And one of the most common tactical maneuvers identified in the text is the use of speech.
Yes, the sight of others' prosperity often sets the envious on talking against them and speaking evil of them,
They might do this even when they don't really know the person well at all.
because the goal is highly calculated. By speaking evil of them, they hope to diminish their honors and lower them in the esteem of men.
It's a form of social leveling. If I cannot elevate my own status to match yours, I will use my words to chip away at your reputation until you are brought back down to my level.
Or preferably below it. Gossip and slander, in this framework, are not just idle chatter.
What are they then?
They are the weaponized expressions of an envious heart attempting to cure its own uneasiness by destroying the prominence of a rival.
That is such a piercing insight. And this naturally escalates to the second manifestation, right? Which moves from mere uneasiness to actual personal dislike and malice.
Yeah. Seeing how others prosper, the envious begin to hate the actual person on account of their honor.
They entertain an evil spirit toward them for no other reason than the fact that they are prospered.
They become embittered in spirit simply because someone else is eminent in name or fortune.
The text revisits the story of Haman for this, pointing out that Haman was full of indignation against Mordecai simply because Mordecai sat in the gate and didn't stand up or move for him.
The prosperity and the perceived lack of deference become a source of intense personal animosity. The successful person is resented as if their success is an actual injury to the envious person.
This is a massive distortion of reality. The envious person genuinely feels wronged, attacked, and injured by a neighbor's good fortune.
Right, as if the neighbor had reached into their house and stolen something directly from their own pockets.
That concept of viewing another's success as a personal injury explains the terrifying escalation we see in the biblical narratives.
It brings us back to Joseph's brothers.
Yeah, because their father loved Joseph, and because of the dreams implying his superiority, the brothers hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him.
The envy metastasized. It started as rejection of his potential superiority, turned into an inability to even have a normal civil conversation with him.
And eventually led to acts of the greatest cruelty and wickedness when they stripped him, threw him in a pit, and sold him into slavery.
The hatred becomes settled. The person is no longer viewed as a brother or a neighbor, but solely as an obstacle to the envious person's desire for eminence.
This destructive cycle, where uneasiness ferments into hatred and hatred breeds cruelty, shows how ingrained this disposition is in the corrupted human nature.
It is so ingrained, so prone to cause utter ruin, that a completely contrary spirit is required to cure it.
The human heart can't fix this on its own through sheer willpower, can it?
No, it requires a radical theological intervention.
And that intervention is presented as the Christian counteroffensive.
The text outlines a three-step response to envy that flows from a genuinely Christian spirit.
What are those 3 steps?
Disallowing its expression, mortifying its principle, and rejoicing in the good of others.
Let's look at the first step. Disallowing the exercise and expressions of such a spirit.
The text acknowledges a very realistic premise here. It assumes that a person influenced by Christian principles may still have envy, as well as other corrupt feelings, arise in their heart.
So the presence of the temptation is not denied. The flesh still wages war.
Right. However, the Christian spirit abhors its spirit as unbecoming and contrary to the nature and will and spirit of God.
The individual recognizes the absolute odiousness of the emotion, seeing its ugliness not just when others display it, but equally when it surfaces in themselves.
Therefore, whenever the emotions of envy begin to rise, the individual is alarmed by it. They don't coddle it.
They don't justify it, and they don't vent it. They fight against it.
They absolutely refuse to allow its exercise for a moment, and they intentionally prevent it from breaking forth into outward words of gossip or actions of malice.
That makes total sense. And that moves us from outward containment to the second step, which is internal eradication, mortifying the principle and disposition in the heart.
To use a modern equivalent, mortifying means actively starving a desire to death.
Cutting off its oxygen supply.
The text says a Christian spirit subdues the very root of the feeling by cultivating a specific alternative.
Contentment with one's own condition and the estate God has given.
This is grounded entirely in the theological concept of God's providence.
Right. The Christian spirit finds quietness and satisfaction regarding the allotments and distributions of stations and possessions which God, in his wise and kind providence, has made to ourselves and others.
This requires trusting that God is both sovereign and good in how he distributes blessings.
The text uses an extreme contrast to illustrate the scope of this contentment, doesn't it?
Yes. It says we should be satisfied whether our rank is as high as that of the angels or as low as that of the beggar at the rich man's gate, referencing the parable of Lazarus in Luke 16.
I have to push back on that, though. Being completely content while covered in sores, starving, and watching a rich man feast.
It is a shocking image.
That sounds entirely impossible for a human being to achieve. How does the text justify that kind of extreme standard?
It justifies it by pointing to the Apostle Paul's declaration in Philippians 4:11, where he states he has learned, in whatsoever state he is, therewith to be content.
Okay, so the justification is that contentment is not derived from the circumstances themselves, but from the source of the circumstances.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. If a person truly believes that a perfectly wise and perfectly kind God has ordained their specific lot for their spiritual good and his glory, then even the estate of Lazarus can be received with contentment.
Because envy argues with God's distribution, contentment submits to it.
The third step, then, is the ultimate victory over envy.
It's not just the absence of malice, nor just a neutral passive contentment, is it?
No, it's a positive disposition to rejoice in the prosperity of others.
The text points to the apostolic rule in Romans 12:15 that we should rejoice with them that do rejoice and weep with them that weep.
This means sympathizing with their estate and condition in the exact same spirit we would feel if it were our own.
This is the definition of true benevolence. This specific spirit of benevolence will actively cast out the evil spirit of envy.
It replaces the desire to see a rival brought down with an ability to find genuine happiness in seeing a neighbor prosper.
Rejoicing with others sounds beautiful in theory, but in practice, it hits very close to the bone.
It does. It goes against everything we naturally feel.
How can a person genuinely rejoice when a neighbor receives the very blessing they have been fervently praying for themselves?
That is the hardest test.
Imagine a family in the church who has been praying for a child for years, going through heartbreak after heartbreak, and they have to sit across the aisle and watch their peers effortlessly announce pregnancy after pregnancy.
Yeah, that is a heavy, heavy burden.
How does a person transition from the natural, agonizing grief of their own lack to genuinely rejoicing for the other?
The text points to the mechanics of sympathy. True sympathy requires a fundamental shift in identity, where your happiness is no longer bound solely to your own private accumulation of blessings.
When true benevolence casts out the evil spirit, you begin to see that God's goodness to your neighbor is still God's goodness.
Right, and therefore worthy of rejoicing, even if it is not currently directed at your specific situation.
You adopt their joy as a shared joy, recognizing that in the body of Christ, a blessing to one is a blessing to the whole.
These three steps, disallowing, mortifying, and rejoicing, are not presented as simple self-help advice for better living.
No, they are anchored in massive theological realities. The text builds a comprehensive case against envy, beginning with the sheer weight of New Testament precepts.
We are given a rapid-fire barrage of scriptural warnings.
Romans 13 commands walking honestly, not in strife and envying.
1 Corinthians 3 blames the church for being carnal because of envying among them.
2 Corinthians 12:20 couples envy with wraths, strifes, and backbitings.
Galatians 5:21 ranks envy alongside murders and drunkenness as abominable works of the flesh.
1 Timothy 6:4 condemns it as implying great wickedness.
Titus 3:3 lists it as a hateful sin of the unconverted state.
James 3 classifies it as earthly, sensual, and devilish.
And 1 Peter 2 warns against it as something that prevents growth in divine things.
The cumulative effect of these citations is staggering. The New Testament views envy not as a minor slip of the tongue or a private bad mood.
It views it as a catastrophic failure of Christian love, categorized alongside the most severe moral breaches like murder.
Beyond the direct commands, the text outlines how the gospel doctrine itself operates as an anti-envy mechanism.
The very nature of the gospel story stands in total opposition to a begrudging spirit.
God the Father did not begrudge us, his well-beloved Son. He did not withhold the highest honor and blessedness from us, even though we were completely unworthy rebels.
Similarly, Christ did not begrudge his labor. He did not withhold his precious blood on the cross, nor does he begrudge us a throne of glory to rule with him in the heavens.
The text contrasts this immense divine generosity with the spirit of Satan.
Yes, Satan, with miserable baseness, envied mankind's happiness in Eden.
His motivation was not just rebellion against God. He could not bear to see humanity in their happy state.
And therefore he exerted himself to the utmost for their ruin. Satan destroyed what he could not tolerate seeing flourish.
Christ, conversely, came into the world to destroy those works of the devil, to deliver us from the misery Satan's envy caused, and to purify our human nature from every trace of that same destructive, devilish spirit.
The historical reality of Christ's life on earth provides the ultimate behavioral model against envy.
The text highlights specific choices Jesus made that defy the human disposition to be uppermost.
He voluntarily chose low and afflictive circumstances. He did not envy those with worldly wealth or covet their condition.
Think about the scene in John 6:15. The multitude, amazed by his miracles, wanted to take him by force and make him a king.
The natural human heart would seize that comparative superiority instantly.
But Jesus actively refused the high honor and withdrew to a mountain alone. He had no desire for worldly eminence.
Furthermore, when John the Baptist was drawing massive crowds from all Judea, Jesus did not resent John's popularity.
Instead, he submitted to John's baptism in the Jordan, even though Jesus was the master and John the servant.
Perhaps most strikingly, Jesus promised his disciples in John 14:12 that they would do greater works than he did.
He was completely free from the desire to be singular and alone in his eminence. He actively empowered his followers to surpass his earthly ministry and scope.
All of this theological and historical weight points directly to the root cause of envy.
And the text identifies the root clearly, doesn't it? It is pride.
Yes, it is the pride of men's hearts that fuels the burning desire to be distinguished and superior to all others.
Pride makes them uneasy and dissatisfied when they see others above them. Because pride is the root, the only effective cure is humility.
The spirit of Christian love works humility in the heart. Love to God implies a sense of God's infinite excellence, which naturally leads to a sense of our own comparative nothingness.
When you see God clearly, your desire to be uppermost among men evaporates. You realize how absurd it is to fight for rank before a holy God.
Similarly, love to men disposes us to acknowledge the excellencies of others, to esteem them better than ourselves, and to concede that the honors bestowed upon them are their due.
This theological framework sets up the final and perhaps most challenging section of the text, the practical application and self-examination.
This is where the text stops explaining and starts demanding answers.
It pivots sharply to address the audience directly, forcing you to hold up a mirror to your own past and present behavior within society and the church.
The text asks a series of piercing diagnostic questions.
It challenges us to look back at our lives, noting that we have long been members of human society, interacting with others in public and private affairs.
We have seen others prosper. We have seen people we considered our equals or even our inferiors advance in wealth, ease, or honor while we were left behind.
The question is, how did those situations affect us? Was there uneasiness? Was there a desire to see them brought down?
Were we glad to hear anything to their disadvantage? Did our forebodings about them actually reveal our secret wishes for their failure?
The text asks if we have ever opposed someone in public affairs or joined a faction against them purely out of an envious spirit.
It asks if our hearts have burned with this feeling. These are not comfortable questions to answer if we are being completely honest with ourselves.
The examination is brought from the past right into the present moment. The text asks what spirit you find as you search your heart today.
Do you carry an old grudge against the person sitting across from you in the house of God?
Is the prosperity of a fellow member at the Lord's table an eyesore to you? Does their success make your life uncomfortable?
Would it bring inward joy and gladness to your heart to see them experience loss or depression?
It's a brutal self-assessment because it strips away all our polite religious veneer. Human beings are experts at masking their envy.
We do not usually admit, even to ourselves, that we are envious.
We justify it. We give it other names. We create elaborate, highly spiritualized excuses for why our opposition to another person's success is actually a righteous stance.
The text anticipates this and systematically breaks down the two most common justifications we use to hide our envy from ourselves, beginning with the excuse of unworthiness.
That first common justification is the claim that the prosperous person is simply not worthy of their success.
We tell ourselves that they do not have the fitness or the moral worthiness for the honors they possess, and that other, lower people are more deserving.
The text asks a brilliant rhetorical question. Where is the man in the world who envies another for his honor or prosperity, but is ready to think or say that that other is not worthy.
The excuse is universal. It points back to the biblical examples to prove this. Did Joseph's brothers think he was worthy of his father's peculiar love?
No, they thought he was an arrogant dreamer.
Did Haman think Mordecai was worthy of the king's honor?
No, he thought he was a disrespectful subordinate.
Did the Jews in the book of Acts think the Gentiles were worthy of the gospel privileges?
No. Whenever someone is promoted, the envious are always ready to improve the occasion to tell of their faults.
They rake up all possible evil about them to prove their unworthiness to the community.
The text offers a flawless diagnostic test to determine if your concern about their unworthiness is genuine or if it is just masked envy.
The question is this: which troubles you more, your neighbor's faults or their prosperity?
That cuts right to the core issue. If you were truly grieved by their moral faults, you would be grieved whether they were prosperous or poor.
Furthermore, if you were genuinely concerned for their character, you would speak to them privately, in the true spirit of Christian compassion and friendship.
You would go to them directly to seek their restoration. You would not use their faults as public ammunition to diminish their reputation.
The fact that their faults only become a topic of conversation when they achieve success proves that the faults are not the real issue.
The prosperity is the issue. The faults are a convenient excuse to attack the prosperity without appearing envious. We use their perceived unworthiness as a smokescreen for our own resentment.
The second justification addressed is the claim that prosperity is actually bad for the person.
We argue that success will make them proud, insufferable, or scornful.
We convince ourselves that it would be best for their own character development to be brought down and humbled.
We frame our desire for their downfall as a kind of tough love concern for their spiritual well-being.
The text applies another stringent test to this excuse. It states that if you truly dislike their prosperity because it harms them spiritually, then you should sincerely lament the injury it causes.
You should feel a true compassion of heart for them. But do your lamentations spring from pity or from envy?
If you genuinely pitied them, you would grieve for their calamity. You would not secretly rejoice when they are brought down.
You must ask yourself, are you grieved for them because their prosperity injures them, or are you grieved for yourself because their prosperity is not yours?
That distinction is razor sharp.
If we are honest, when someone we envy experiences a setback, our initial internal reaction is rarely sorrow for their pain.
It is usually a grim satisfaction that the scales have been balanced.
The text also touches on a particularly insidious form of this sin, spiritual envy. This occurs when we envy others not for material wealth, but for their spiritual prosperity or their standing before God.
The examples given are chilling. Cain envying Abel's accepted sacrifice. Ishmael mocking Isaac, the child of promise. The Jewish leaders envying Christ's authority, and the elder brother resenting the grace shown to the prodigal son.
Think about modern call-out culture within religious circles. How much of the public tearing down of prominent figures is driven by a genuine desire for theological purity, and how much is driven by spiritual envy?
People tear down others' moral or spiritual standing to elevate their own. It is perhaps the most dangerous form because it uses the language of religion to oppose the very work of God in another person's life.
We must beware of cherishing that spirit, and instead learn to rejoice in the good estate of others as if it were our own.
Having dismantled the excuses, the text summarizes the stark dichotomy we are left with. It describes the spirit of envy as the very contrary of the spirit of heaven.
In heaven, everyone rejoices in the happiness of others. There is no comparative anxiety.
Envy, therefore, is the very spirit of hell itself. It is a disposition that feeds itself on the ruin of the happiness of others.
We are brought back to the image of the caterpillar destroying the flourishing plants.
And the strong language of Solomon in Proverbs 14:30 is quoted, "A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy is the rottenness of the bones."
It is a foolish self-injury, making the envious person thoroughly uncomfortable simply because someone else has a blessing.
The alternative is divine charity, the spirit of Christian love, which always leads us to rejoice in the welfare of others.
Quoting 1 John 4, we are instructed that this love is of God, and he who dwells in love dwells in God.
So we have these two entirely opposite ways of living.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we conclude this analysis. We have discussed how envy disguises itself, how it justifies its malice, and how it rots the bones.
But the true test of your heart happens in a fraction of a second.
Yes. When a peer, someone right next to you, experiences a sudden, immense stroke of good fortune, pay attention to your immediate, unfiltered internal reaction. That initial flinch is a flawless diagnostic tool.
It is very revealing.
It reveals precisely where your treasure lies. If their gain instantly feels like your personal loss, you must ask yourself a serious question. What finite resource are you worshiping instead of the infinite God who distributes his gifts exactly as he sees fit?